It was the late hours of the evening when Dr. Henry Lawson found himself standing at the edge of a forgotten cemetery. The soft, amber glow of the setting sun barely reached the corners of the graves, casting long shadows across the desolate site. Henry had been studying ancient burial practices for years, but tonight he was standing before a grave that had piqued his interest more than any other. This particular grave was old, so old in fact that records of its existence were sparse. The name etched on the gravestone was barely legible, faded by the wear of centuries. Yet despite the wear, Henry could still make out the name, Amelia Vance. She had died over 150 years ago, a woman whose name had almost been lost to time, but her grave had somehow remained preserved through the ages. This was the grave that had drawn him here tonight. Henry had heard rumors of a discovery that could revolutionize the understanding of ancient burial rituals, and it was here, in this forgotten corner of the cemetery, that the breakthrough lay waiting. With his excavation tools in hand, he approached the grave cautiously. The air had a strange stillness to it, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Henry's heart thudded in his chest as he set down his tools beside the weathered stone. The task ahead was daunting, and the weight of the unknown pressed on him. What could be buried here? What would he find under the earth, hidden away for so long? As he began to dig, the air grew cooler, and the soft evening breeze barely stirred the leaves around him. The ground was firm and packed tightly, making each shovel full feel like it weighed a ton. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the silence around him growing heavier. Every movement felt deliberate, like the earth itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. He reached deeper into the earth, and as the night grew darker, the light from his lantern flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows across the scene. He had uncovered a wooden casket, long forgotten by time. It was small and plain, almost unremarkable, but there was something about it that sent a chill down his spine. Henry hesitated for a moment. Was he prepared for what was about to come? The rumors surrounding this grave were nothing more than whispers. Stories passed down by locals who claimed that this particular burial had never been fully documented. With a steadying breath, Henry continued, digging around the sides of the casket until he could gently lift it from the ground. The wood creaked in protest, as if it too had been waiting for someone to disturb it. As he opened the lid of the casket, his eyes went wide with disbelief. What he found inside would change the course of history and shock everyone who would later learn of it. The moment Dr. Henry Lawson opened the casket, he was hit by a thick, musty smell that made his stomach churn. The air in the grave had been sealed away for so long, and now the atmosphere felt heavy with age. He recoiled slightly, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation as he peered inside. At first, he thought it was just an ordinary burial. There, lying in the casket, was a skeleton, bleached white by the passage of time. But as he examined it more closely, something wasn't quite right. The bones were arranged in a strange, almost deliberate fashion, unlike anything he had seen in his years of research. The posture of the remains suggested that the body hadn't been laid to rest in the usual manner. It was almost as if the corpse had been positioned in a specific pose, one that seemed to defy tradition and reason. His gloved hands trembled as he carefully brushed away some of the soil and dirt that had settled inside the casket. As he did, he noticed something that made his breath catch. A small, faded object clutched in the skeletal hand. A relic, perhaps? Henry leaned closer, his fingers shaking as he gently pried open the hand. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw what was inside. It was a small, ornate key, rusted with age but undeniably intricate. He had never seen anything like it before. The craftsmanship was unlike any known style, and yet the key seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, almost as if it was waiting for him to discover its purpose. The air around him seemed to grow heavier as he held the key in his hands. What was it for? Why had it been buried with the body? And why had it been placed so carefully in the skeletal hand? He couldn't stop himself from feeling a growing sense of unease. As he carefully placed the key aside, something strange happened. The ground beneath him shifted. A faint vibration ran through the earth, something that wasn't natural. At first it was so subtle, he almost thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him. But then it became impossible to ignore. His lantern flickered violently, casting shadows that danced across the graveyard. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the ground beneath him trembled again, this time more intensely. The trees around him rustled in an unnatural way, as if they were reacting to what he had uncovered. He stood up quickly, brushing dirt from his pants and scanning the area, feeling the unease grow inside him. Was this just the result of his imagination running wild, or was something far darker unfolding in front of him? The answer came when a sudden loud crack echoed in the distance, followed by a deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The cemetery ground shook again, this time more violently, as if the earth itself were reacting to the disturbance. Henry's pulse quickened. What had he uncovered? What had the key unlocked? There were no signs of life in the surrounding area, yet the noise had been too real to ignore. The air felt charged with an unfamiliar energy, one that only seemed to intensify the longer he stood there. The eerie stillness returned, but it was different now. The cemetery, which had once felt abandoned and forgotten, now felt like it was alive in some strange, otherworldly way. Something had been disturbed. Shaken, but driven by an overwhelming curiosity, Henry realized that his research had just taken an unexpected turn. He had dug up more than just bones. He had disturbed something ancient, something that had been buried for a reason. And the question burned in his mind. Was this grave truly the final resting place of Amelia Vance? Or was it the key to something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined? Henry's mind raced as he stared at the small, rusted key in his hand. The ground still trembled beneath him, and a faint but persistent vibration seemed to hum through the earth, like the heartbeat of something ancient. The key felt heavier than it looked, almost alive in its own right, as though it carried a weight far greater than the years of history it had endured. The rumbling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. But the air felt thick now, charged with a strange energy that made Henry's skin crawl. He had spent years studying ancient cultures and forgotten rituals, but nothing in his research had prepared him for this. The feeling that something, someone, was watching him was impossible to shake. As his mind struggled to make sense of the situation, Henry's thoughts turned back to the body he had uncovered. Why had this woman been buried in such a peculiar way? And why was the key placed so carefully in her hand, almost like a final request? He glanced around the graveyard, feeling as though the shadows were closing in on him. It was as if the place had become something else entirely, alive with secrets, its history begging to be uncovered. Suddenly, Henry's attention was drawn back to the grave. The earth beneath the casket seemed to pulse, the soil shifting again, as though the grave itself was reacting to his presence. With a deep breath, he knelt down beside the grave, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. Something was happening here. Something was awakening. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers still wrapped around the key. Should he try it? Should he dare to see what it opened? The logical part of him screamed to stop, to call for help, to report what he'd found. But his curiosity, the insatiable thirst for knowledge that had driven him all these years, pushed him forward. This was a discovery. This was something that could change everything. Henry pushed the key toward a small hidden latch he'd noticed at the base of the gravestone earlier. It seemed to be a perfect fit, as though the key had been waiting for him all along. With a sharp twist, the latch clicked open. The ground trembled once again, but this time, it was not the earth beneath him that shifted. It was the very stone of the grave. The gravestone groaned, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to echo through the ground, reverberating in Henry's chest. Then, with a suddenness that took his breath away, the grave opened. A deep, dark pit yawned open before him, the ground beneath the gravestone giving way to reveal an ancient underground passage. The stone walls of the passageway were covered in moss and strange, unreadable symbols. The air that rushed up from the darkness felt damp and cold, filled with the musty scent of earth and something else, a faint metallic tang that made Henry's stomach turn. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned over the edge of the pit, peering into the abyss. This was no ordinary grave. This was a tomb, but it was unlike any tomb Henry had ever seen. He glanced down at the key in his hand, which seemed to hum with an energy that almost felt like a warning. Had he just unlocked something far older and far more dangerous than he could possibly understand? In that moment, a cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying with it a whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. You shouldn't have opened it. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was not his imagination. It was real. Henry pulled away from the edge of the pit, his pulse racing. He turned around quickly, scanning the empty graveyard. But there was no one there. Just the trees, the wind, and the feeling that he was not alone. The whisper had been clear, and it had been warning him. Henry stood at the edge of the open grave, his heart racing as the eerie silence of the cemetery pressed down on him. The air had grown heavier, thick with tension, and the strange voice that had whispered to him echoed in his mind. You shouldn't have opened it. The words sent a chill down his spine, the warning not something he could simply brush off. He glanced down at the pit once again, the darkness below swallowing the faint light from his lantern. What was down there? His instinct screamed at him to turn away, to abandon this place, but the unexplainable pull of curiosity was stronger than fear. What had been hidden for so long? With a deep breath, he carefully set the lantern down by the edge of the grave. The flickering light cast long, distorted shadows, adding to the foreboding atmosphere. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was buried below wasn't just some ancient artifact. It was something far more sinister. The question was it something his research could explain? Or had he just unearthed a terrible mistake? Henry adjusted his grip on the key in his hand, the rusted metal now feeling heavier, almost like an anchor dragging him into the abyss. With a steady hand, he began to lower himself into the grave, his eyes scanning the blackness below. There had to be an explanation for this, for the feeling of dread that seemed to cling to the very air. He couldn't let fear rule him now, not when he was so close to an extraordinary discovery. His feet finally touched the ground, and he crouched down to get a better look at the passage. The walls were lined with stone, cracked and weathered with age, yet intact. The strange symbols were still visible, faint but noticeable, carved into the stone like warnings or directions. He didn't understand them, but he could feel their significance. They weren't just decoration, they had purpose. He took a deep breath, and as he exhaled, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft scraping, like metal on stone. What was that? He stiffened, his eyes darting around. The sound grew louder, and it was coming from deeper within the passage, from the far end where the stone walls seemed to curve. It was an unsettling sound, one that made his skin crawl, and it wasn't the wind this time. Henry turned toward the source of the noise, his footsteps tentative as he made his way deeper into the passage. The walls around him seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him from all sides. The scraping sound continued, now accompanied by a faint buzzing hum, like a swarm of insects or something far more ominous. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, its size hidden by the shadows that clung to the walls. In the center of the room stood an altar, made of black stone, its surface covered in moss and grime. But what caught his attention immediately wasn't the altar. It was the figure that stood in front of it, a tall, shadowy shape, nearly hidden by the dark. For a moment, Henry's heart stopped. Had someone been down here? Had they been watching him? The figure was still, unmoving, but the sound of scraping intensified. It was as if the figure was trying to communicate, to summon something. Henry's pulse quickened as he took a cautious step forward, the chill in the air biting at his skin. Something wasn't right. The scraping stopped, and then the figure spoke. You shouldn't be here. None of you should have come. Henry's breath hitched, his thoughts swirling with fear and confusion. The voice was hollow yet strangely familiar, as if it were part of the very air around him. He couldn't place it, but it felt as though the figure knew exactly who he was, knew why he had come. Suddenly, the shadows around the figure seemed to stretch out, writhing like dark tendrils. The ground beneath Henry's feet rumbled again, the chamber vibrating as though it were coming to life. The voice, cold and filled with warning, spoke once more. Leave now, while you still can. You've opened something that should never have been disturbed. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the figure's voice echoed in the chamber, the warning hanging in the air like a cloud of poison. You've opened something that should never have been disturbed. His body was frozen, a chill running through him that had nothing to do with the cold air of the underground passage. He felt the weight of the words sink into him, pressing on his mind, clouding his judgment. The figure remained still, its form shrouded in darkness. But it wasn't entirely invisible. There was a faint outline, an unnatural shape, almost like a distortion in the air itself. The shadows moved around it, pulsating with a strange energy that Henry couldn't explain. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained planted to the ground. With trembling hands, Henry reached for his lantern, the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. He could feel the temperature drop even further. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't identify, pressing in on him from all sides. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was fully aware of Henry's fear. Its presence seemed to weigh on the very air, the darkness surrounding it deepening. The ground beneath Henry's feet seemed to shift again, as if it was alive, reacting to the figure's approach. "What is this?" Henry managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Who are you?" The figure didn't immediately respond. Instead, the chamber seemed to pulse in time with Henry's heart. The shadows stretched further, wrapping around the walls like a living thing, constricting, tightening. It was as if the very room itself was closing in on him. Finally, the figure spoke again, its voice deeper now, layered with a strange, hollow resonance. "I am the keeper. I am the one who watches over what was never meant to be known." Henry's mind raced. The keeper? What did that mean? What had he uncovered? And why had this figure chosen to speak to him now? The casket, the grave, the strange key, none of it made sense. "I never wanted to bring anyone here, but you forced your hand, Henry Lawson." The figure's voice now held an unmistakable authority, as though it were speaking directly into his mind. "You've disturbed something ancient, and now you must pay the price." A cold surge of fear rushed through Henry as the words hit him with full force. Pay the price? What was it that he had awoken? The feeling of unease escalated, turning into a desperate panic. The figure's presence grew heavier, almost suffocating. Henry looked around the room, searching for any way out. The shadows seemed to close in, making it impossible to move. His legs felt like lead, his body trapped in the midst of something he couldn't understand, something he wasn't prepared for. The key, now lying in the dirt by his feet, seemed to call to him, beckoning him to take action. But what could he do? The price is knowledge, and with knowledge comes power. The figure's voice dripped with dark promise. But not all power is meant for the living. Henry took a step back, his eyes wide, searching desperately for answers. The air in the room seemed to shimmer with unnatural energy, and the shadows that surrounded the figure began to warp, twisting into shapes that were impossible to comprehend. He could feel the weight of something ancient, something malevolent, pressing down on him. Before he could react, a sudden movement from the shadows caught his attention. The ground beneath him shifted again, this time with a force that sent him sprawling to the floor. The darkness seemed to pulse, moving closer and closer, as if it were alive, intent on swallowing him whole. Henry scrambled to his feet, his breath shallow, panic taking over as the figure began to step closer, its presence overwhelming. There was no escape. "You've opened the door, Henry Lawson, and now you will see what lies beyond it." The figure's voice was final, filled with dread. "But be warned, once the door is opened, it can never be closed." The darkness surged, engulfing the chamber, and Henry felt himself being pulled toward the unknown, his mind consumed with terror and confusion. What had he done? What had he unleashed? The darkness pressed in on Henry from all sides, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. The figure, this keeper, loomed over him, its presence felt in the very air around him. The shadows continued to twist, curling like tendrils of smoke, as though they were alive, bound to some ancient will. Henry's mind raced. What was happening? Why had he opened this grave? Why had he come here in the first place? The warnings, the whispers, the unexplained tremors of the earth. It was all so overwhelming, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. You've unleashed something much darker than you realize, Henry. The figure's voice seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath him, as if the earth itself were speaking. You've disturbed the boundary between worlds, and now the consequences will be yours to bear. A chill ran through him. The shadows were closing in, the space around him warping and shifting. He could feel the weight of the room increasing with every second, the darkness around him becoming thicker, as if it were trying to swallow him whole. But then a surge of clarity hit him. The key. The key had to mean something. He glanced down at the rusted metal still in his hand. It was the only physical connection he had to whatever ancient force was awakening in this place. Without thinking, he stepped forward, reaching for the key, which seemed to glow faintly as it touched the air. His hand trembled as he approached the altar at the center of the chamber, the one that had drawn him to this grave in the first place. You don't understand, Henry. That key cannot save you. The figure's voice had taken on a more insistent, almost commanding tone. It was never meant for you. It was meant for her. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her? Who was the her the keeper was talking about? He had no time to dwell on it. The vibrations from the earth were now reverberating through his very bones, and the coldness around him seemed to intensify. He felt the key's weight in his hand, pulling him forward, urging him to continue. With a sudden burst of determination, he approached the altar. He wasn't sure if he could control what was happening, but the more he held the key, the more he could feel its power surging through him. There was no going back now. The key fit perfectly into a hidden slot at the base of the altar, and with a sharp turn, the entire chamber seemed to shift. The ground beneath him groaned as a massive stone door in the back of the chamber began to rise, its heavy weight creaking against centuries of rust and decay. Henry stumbled backward, his eyes wide in horror. What had he just done? As the stone door opened, the air in the room grew impossibly cold, and the darkness that had been closing in around him began to shift, revealing something from deep within the earth. A figure, tall, robed, with eyes that glowed like embers, stood beyond the door. It was not human. It stepped forward, and the shadows swirled around it, as if obeying its every movement. You have unlocked the door to the other side, Henry. The voice came from the figure, deep and ancient, a voice that seemed to resonate with the very core of the world. Now, you must decide what comes next. Henry's body trembled as he stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure's eyes glowed even brighter now, and the temperature in the room plummeted to unbearable levels. The boundary had been breached. There was no turning back, and the consequences of his actions had now unleashed something much greater than he could have ever imagined.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.